Hi, this is Weiss from Worn & Wound, and today I'll be taking a look at the Bell & Ross BR05. Back at Baselworld 2019, Bell & Ross showed us a preview of a watch that took us by surprise. A chimera of sorts, it had Bell & Ross DNA, but mixed in with a large, perhaps dominant amount of Genta DNA. The result was the BR05, a whole new line for Bell & Ross, and one that we knew was going to be controversial. Upon release, the watch got many of the expected comments. It was criticized for looking too much like a Royal Oak, a Nautilus, or something sort of in between. And in fairness, those comments aren't wrong. The BR05 is a derivative design, but one from a popular brand that people respect and trust. It has something, well, two things to be exact, that those incredibly famous watches don't. It's readily available, and while far from inexpensive, not down payment on a house priced either. So while acknowledging that the BR05 is neither a good value at $4,900 on a bracelet, or a particularly original design, I wanted to take a look at it. It is, after all, appealing in its own right, and an interesting new direction from a brand that typically makes watches inspired by aviation equipment. Let's kick this off with the obvious. The BR05 is an integrated bracelet steel sports watch, meaning that the case flows directly into the bracelet, which uses a non-traditional lug shape, so no swapping in your favorite strap later. The main case of the watch consists of a 40mm square form with a rounded square bezel that sits just a bit offset from the mid-case. Both feature beautifully textured vertical brushing and mirror-polished chamfers with sharp lines separating the surfaces. On the right side is a slightly too small crown with screw-on crown guards on either side, and studding the corners of the bezel are polished screw heads. A detail I'm conflicted about, the screws are a signature detail of Bell & Ross's square instrument watches, but they're also a signature detail of the Royal Oak bezel. Yes, the execution is different, but in this setting, I can't help but think this might have been a step too far into Oak territory. At the same time, the bezel needed some detail to break up the empty space between the dial and the corner. Like I said, conflicted. With a screwed-on display case back, the whole thing comes to just 10.7mm thick. This goes a long way towards the BR05's best feature, which is how well it wears, but I'll get back to that later. The ends of the mid-case have been sheared off in a manner that is also very reminiscent of the Royal Oak, and feature more of that exceptional brushing. This is a dramatic and highly attractive element of the design, which also creates the correct angle for the bracelet to grow out of. Then, in a combination of brushed tapering H's and polished rounded square connecting links, the bracelet is formed, coming to a close with a butterfly clasp under the wrist. As said already, the overall design of the case and bracelet is derivative, but it's not identical to anything either. I do think Bell & Ross successfully created an appealing variant on the 70s luxury concept that incorporates their square DNA. And perhaps more importantly, they executed it well. Integrated sport watches live and die by their finishing, and the BR05 is very nicely finished in my book. One note though about those polished links on the bracelet. They provide a fairly large and flat reflective surface, which in turn creates a lot of bling. So much so that at dinner out with my girlfriend, she actually complained the reflections were getting in her eyes. On a more serious note, they are at high risk for scratches, as this review sample clearly illustrates. It's not a great look, so I'm a bit concerned about how this watch will age. While the case and bracelet of the BR05 are pretty exciting and dramatic, the dial is kind of plain, especially in comparison. Seen here in the silver variety, which gives the watch an appealing monochromatic palette, the dial consists of a sunray surface with applied batons and numerals with substantial lume fill. For the hands, they went with rounded baton shapes that correspond with the markers. They fit the dial, but are so similar to Nautilus 5711 hands that I can't help but think something else could have been advisable here. The overall design echoes the aviation dials that Bell & Ross is known for, with a slightly softer, rounder look that speaks to 70s luxury watches as well. There is one departure from the typical Bell & Ross design that I found disappointing, however, which is that in lieu of a marker at 3, they put a pretty standard date window. When I think of Bell & Ross, other than the square cases, their use of an offset date between 4 and 5 with a corrected date angle comes to mind. They aren't the only brand to do this, but it's pervasive in their line and a detail that I think would have been great to integrate here, allowing them to keep the marker at 3 and adding more of their unique flair. Instead, they went the generic route, and the result is that the dial is kind of plain and frankly a bit boring. And more to the point, it just doesn't look like the dial I expect to find in a watch that costs nearly $5,000. Inside of the BR05 is the Bell & Ross Caliber 321, which is a rebadged Sellita SW300. While the functionality is the same as a standard 300, Bell & Ross did give it an aesthetic overhaul by matte blasting the whole thing to a dark gray. and by adding a very cool rotor that covers the whole movement, revealing it through a lattice. I quite like the look of it. It's a departure from the perlage and Geneva stripes that you typically find on decorated Swiss movements, and effectively gives the movement a bespoke look. Now onto the fun part, how the BR05 wears. It turns out that a 40mm square is pretty much the perfect shape for my 7-inch wrist, sitting centered and having more presence than expected while still being comfortable all day, even under several winter layers. And it just looks so good when you glance down at your wrist. While it's easy to overanalyze the parts individually, I am a critic after all, it's really how everything comes together that matters, and the BR05 really comes together. The shape is strong and masculine, but not over the top like so many modern luxury timepieces. It's clear that Bell & Ross has learned a thing or two from the vintage craze of the last few years. A modern watch can still be bold without being oversized. In terms of style, I don't think I wore anything it didn't look good with. The neutral, all-metal palette is a total chameleon, and it felt appropriate on my wrist no matter where the setting. And in a shock to my personal sense of style, I didn't hate that it was a bit blingy. It's a watch that calls some attention to itself, and therefore the wearer, yet didn't feel obnoxious or in bad taste. Well done, Bell & Ross. To wrap up, the Bell & Ross BR05 is a bit of an odd bird. The design is derivative of Genta icons that even bearing some resemblance to can cause a severe backlash. Yet the watch looks undeniably appealing, and it fits well into the Bell & Ross lineup. They successfully took their own vocabulary of forms and integrated them with that iconic 70s luxury style to create a hybrid of aesthetics that just works. And more importantly, it's really wonderful to wear. Is it a good value? No, not really. With Tudor offering in-house chronometers at $3,500 and Omega with their coaxial master chronometers starting just under $5, the bar for value, even amongst Swiss retail brands, has gotten high. I personally think the BR05 should have started around $3,500, which still would have been expensive, but would have put them just a notch over the BRV2 92s on bracelets, fitting in better with their own catalog. In the end, secondhand prices will be more tolerable anyway. Regardless, for Bell & Ross fans and those who ache for unobtainable steel sport watches, the BR05 is a watch very worth taking a look at. Who knows, it might scratch an itch for a luxury style you didn't even know you had. If you enjoyed this review, please subscribe and hit the like button below. And please be sure to read the full review at wornandwound.com. See you next time.